Welcome and good evening, and thank you for being here. Stephen Dedalus, in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, said the first thing that has to happen with a work of art, it must arrest you. It seizes your attention. And then all the other wonderful things can continue on from that, the radiance, the harmony, the wholeness. You can read it in the book. But what started this whole chain of events leading to this panel tonight was a video by Miles Inada, we'll give you the link by the end of the evening, about the Japanese-American internment in World War II. And it reached out across the internet and grabbed me. I had never seen anything like it. I had to understand what it was telling me, what it represented, and how it came to be. Luckily, Diana Buddy, our UWMC art instructor, had already been arrested by this video and had asked Miles to come as the artist in residence. She has a career-long history of doing community engagement in the arts, of which we're very proud and to which we're very grateful. So she invited Miles to come and spend the week and to share with community art students at Lincoln and Grant School, and thank you, big shout out to Carla Myrek for helping that come to be. She's a great ally of ours too in this effort. Miles has come and he's in Diana's drawing class. Out of that spun a deliberation, something that my institute, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, does a lot of. We've gotten students talking about these issues. From that came the inviting of some other key people. My boss, Eric Giordano, the director of the Institute, said, I know somebody that can speak to that. His specialty is Japanese-American literature, and that's Charles Inouye. Once Charles came aboard, I had to ask my old friend Eric Takeshita, who came last year for a session on community development in the arts. This thing grew organically. And tonight, you're here to hear all the pieces and how they fit together. You'll hear sub-themes of social injustice, community engagement in the arts, the meaning of the arts, civil rights, current events that might be worth a cautionary tale on the same topics, racial profiling. I'm hoping Eric will pull all that together for you. But for now, I'm just grateful to the Student Lecture and Fine Arts Committee and their funding of this project, WIPS, the institute for which I work, our panelists, and you, mostly you, for coming to hear what it's all about. I thank you. And I'd like to, without further ado, introduce Eric Takeshita. He'll be sharing a bit more about his background, but I'll let you know that Eric's work focuses on the nexus of how art and culture can be used to empower individuals and build a stronger community. He is Senior Program Officer for the Local Initiative Support Corporation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where he helps support community-based efforts to build stronger neighborhoods. He's Board Vice President of Springboard for the Arts, an artist-serving organization that helps artists make a living and a life, and he's a consultant and educator. Previously, Eric directed the Art Center in Honolulu and served as senior policy aide to Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Ryback. He holds a master's degree from Harvard University's Kennedy School and received his undergraduate scholarship for his work as a ceramic artist. Currently lives in the Twin Cities with his wife and his two daughters, who are 9 and 11. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you all again for coming. It's really, as Jean mentioned, my work does kind of center at this nexus of how art and culture can be used to build a stronger community. So when the opportunity came to come here and come back to UW Marathon County, I just couldn't resist, and this topic was obviously one that's very near and dear to my heart. Yeah, I wanted to actually just start, you were talking, Jean mentioned kind of shout outs. I guess I want to kind of do a quick shout out and acknowledge that today's Veterans Day, right? And I just want to actually, before we do anything, I just want to give my thanks and gratitude to the men and women that are serving our country today, and also for all those that came before them. And so before we start, I just want a quick moment of silence to kind of thank those. Thank you. One of the things I thought was really interesting in terms of timing is that one of the most decorated battalions in World War II was actually the 442nd, which was an all-volunteer Japanese-American battalion that had this incredibly high number of casualties. And many of these men actually came out of the internment camps. These were folks that were actually interred that volunteered then to serve our country in uniform. And I think there actually is a special ceremony today in Washington, D.C., recognizing and honoring them. So I appreciate the kind of the serendipity of having this particular conversation today on Veterans Day. You know, Jean mentioned that I'd share a little bit about myself. I'm from the Twin Cities. I'm from Minneapolis, St. Paul. I live there now. I'm a fourth-generation Japanese American. So my family has been in this country since about the 1880s. My family was in Hawaii, or still is actually. Much of my family is still in Hawaii. And so I want to, in the interest of full disclosure, to name that while I'm Japanese American, my family was not actually interred. Japanese Americans in the state of Hawaii were not put in internment camps because we comprise the majority of the population. And, you know, it's kind of hard to do that. It also kind of, I think, illustrated the fallacy and kind of the pretext on which Japanese Americans were interred, because obviously Hawaii was kind of one of the most strategic bases for the U.S. In World War II, right? And so it kind of really speaks to the fact that it was a complete fabrication, the kind of the justification, the strategic justification of interning Japanese Americans was just completely false. Otherwise, they would have had to inter Japanese Americans in Hawaii. So I wanted to share that kind of disclosure that my family wasn't interred. But I will say that even though it's not part of my own history, it has clearly, deeply affected who I am, how I walk in this world, and the work that I do. As I mentioned, my work is really at this nexus of how art and culture can be used to empower communities of color and individuals to build a stronger and healthy community. In part, it's because of my own experience, right? I grew up in St. Paul, and much like Wausau here, you know, when I was coming up, it was a time when you were either white or you were black. And I wasn't really either of those things. And much of my kind of early years was this kind of searching and longing for identity and a sense of who I was. So that brought me to school. I did my undergraduate work in Southern California thinking, oh, this will be great, hang out with other Asian Americans, kind of figure out who I am. Realized that all my friends were from the Midwest, right? My best friend's from Kansas, my friends are from Wisconsin, Minnesota, what have you. And it was when I went back to Minnesota, and it was through the arts, and it was through the theater arts specifically, that an Asian American theater company that validated my existence as an Asian American in Minnesota specifically. And so this idea of how the arts can arrest, I think to use Jean's word, can kind of arrest us and help us give a sense of voice, identity, agency, and really then find a way that we can give back and make a contribution to the world is a real a core part of who I am and a core part of my narrative. So I wanted to just kind of share that, because one of the themes that we have today for the panel is really to just share a little bit about ourselves and our own stories and how those can really relate to other folks, right? And that's kind of the intent. And I just need to say how grateful I am to be here with you all. And again, my thanks to the Lecture in Fine Art Series and also Wisconsin Public Policy, the Institute for Public Policy. I'm amazed at this panel. I had a chance to meet folks earlier today, and kind of the ability of the staff to organize this panel and bring folks from really across the country together to be here tonight is really incredible. They're all going to kind of share a little bit more about themselves, but just briefly, I want to start with, we're going to start off this evening with Miles, who has been here for the last week, actually, working in the schools and here on campus, who's from the University of Southern Oregon, or Southern Oregon University, as a professor there in the arts department. And we're going to start off with him, and again, we're going to lead with the arts. We're going to then turn things over quickly to Charles, who's a professor at Tufts University, and he'll share a little bit more about his background and his story, which is a fascinating story and a journey that started in Utah, driving tractors and reading at night. So we'll go turn things over to Charles and talk about his journey from Utah to Japan and now out east. And then we're going to kind of bring things home, literally, with Ka, who's going to talk a little bit about her own experience, kind of being born and raised here in Wausau. So that's a little bit about our journey. We hope to try to leave ample time at the end for questions and answers. So please, you know, kind of as we're going, Write down your questions, jot them down, and we'll have a chance hopefully at the end for some Q&A, and then I know there's also a reception afterwards for us to kind of share more. My role, though, is to really help moderate this and turn it over to our esteemed panel of experts. So with that, I guess, Miles, I'd like to turn things over to you.
Okay, please. Great. All right, well, thank you, Eric, and thank you all for having me out here. It's been an incredible experience and very humbling to, get to work with people from, Diana's great students and, the kids at the elementary school, Lincoln and Grant, and maybe some of you guys went to those places. I was looking how Grant, goes back to the 20s. They have the basketball teams back there, that was really, really something. So thank you again very much. It's been a wonderful week. Well, I thought I would start off and actually show the animation that I did that we finished in 2004 called Legends from Camp. And just a bit of background on it. Legends from Camp is actually the title of a collection of my father's poems that came out in the 90s. And in the 90s, we received a grant from the government called the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund. So we received a production grant to do this. And I think it's interesting to kind of, there's a bit of not really a paradox, but it's an interesting tension that I think speaks well about the country. And since this is Veterans Day, as Eric said, it's worth kind of thinking about that. We received this very generous grant from the government basically to criticize our government, and to address this issue, which I thought really says something, about the United States and where we live and how important that idea of free speech is, and that, there aren't too many other places that would be prone to do that. So I thought that just that kind of appreciation. So while we're being critical and asking some pretty tough questions at the same time, just acknowledging that. So again, this started with my father. My father was born in 1938, was interned in the Japanese American internment camps, started off in the Fresno Fairgrounds. And since, University of Wisconsin Marathon County is right next to the fairgrounds here, we were talking about this. It's interesting to kind of imagine what that would be like if we said, well, we're going to take Ka and all these kids, these great little kids that are, from the Hmong community, in Grant Elementary School and Lincoln, and we're going to stick them over in the fairgrounds so they can't go to school, and they're going to, put them over here. And then, and then after a while, we're going to ship them down to Arkansas, which is where my dad and his family went, and then from there to Colorado on these trains. So it is kind of chilling. I mean, to think about it, when you start to think about the particulars of it, and start to think, wow, what would that be like? What a strange thing. So that question had always been very close to my thinking. And I'd known a lot about it growing up. Where I live in Ashland, Oregon, is close to the Tule Lake internment camps, which are about 70 miles away. So we went out there and visited that during the course of doing this. And it was interesting that, it was kind of a surprise. We went out there and we saw some of the buildings are still being used for highway department. We kind of looked at them to the chain link fence and went, wow, took some pictures. And then we said, well, wait a minute, look over there. And, there were the camps. It was wild that the camps are still there in Tule Lake, and people are living in them. And so we drove over there, and it was, they're incredibly run down, because they were just basically these tar paper shacks out in the middle of the desert, that are 60 years old. And there were people, I think they were mostly like maybe migrant farmers and things living in these really, desolate, and, the fence was gone. So, you can come and go as you want, It's kind of interesting to start to think about that, and then the guard towers were gone. No, do whatever you want. It's free country. So, and just one other thing I think too that ties in, I think, with Wisconsin, is to think about one of the closest parallels is to the Native American, story, and how the kind of the relocation of populations to places that are not particularly hospitable or, their native land or native area. So this began, and with this treatment of the poems. And so what we decided to do was to try to create something that would be done kind of by my generation, that I was not in the camps, but to somehow make the story real. As we started to think about how are we going to treat this topic, we tended to think almost in terms of a documentary at first. Well, in 1941, 110,000 Japanese American, were interned, and kind of that, just to tell that story. And then as we did that, we said, well, there are already a number of really excellent scholarly books and articles and documentaries already done on this. Well, what do we do? Well, we're animators, we're artists. And so, my dad's a poet. So that idea of trying to create something that would somehow maybe live or come to life in people's minds, that it would make them ask some questions. What did I just see? What was that? And maybe activate that interest in their mind. And since we're talking about art and aesthetics, that idea that art can serve almost like a Trojan horse, that you can, people say, oh, great, someone gave us a big wooden horse. What a nice present, So you think it's one thing, and you let it in the gates, and then, all manner of mischief can kind of happen after that. And I think that idea of art can do that. That's really the power of it, that its rhetorical value as persuasion, is incredibly powerful. And so that was our hope, I think, in doing this, is that we could create something that would arrest people's attention and get them to think about it. And maybe, I think when sometimes we watch documentary movies, we're like, well, I don't have that much in common with those people because they all lived in black and white, or they walked really fast, even that was a function of the technology, the different frame rates. But so we kind of have this barrier sometimes, where it's easy to think like, oh, that's not me, or that, oh yeah, that was crazy back then, or and so anyway, that idea to hopefully get inside of people's resistances and to talk about it. So I don't know, that might be enough for right now to introduce the film, and maybe if Chris is back there, we could go ahead and let you guys take a look and see what you think. So thank you for watching that. It's kind of a conversation stopper sometimes, I know, but I just wanted to address a little bit too. We talked about some of the themes of the talk and the idea of agency and kind of how art can be this powerful voice, for people to tell their own story and how important that is. Because if you don't tell your own story, no one else is going to tell it for you. Pixar's not going to tell it for you, or Disney's not going to tell it for you. They're going to tell you their version of, what they would like your story to be or what they would like you to think your story should be. But, the idea of doing your own story, and we really looked very closely at a lot of the artwork that was done by the men and women who were interned in the camps, and just one of the guys that was interned was Chira Obata, who was an art professor at University of California, Berkeley, and did some very powerful drawings. And anyway, there were some great collections that other scholars had put together of the artwork that people did. Because in the camps, they did tell their own story, and because they told their story, we could tell the story again, so to speak. And so that idea, what might seem as insignificant or just a personal effort, really does, you can't tell how it's going to give voice to the next generation or the next generation. And so that idea of agency, I think that, as Eric put it so well, I think is so critical, in the arts and creating the opportunity for that kind of a thing to happen. So, and maybe that might be a good segue into the
Great.
next thing.
Thanks, Miles. I just want to again thank you, Miles, for sharing your art, and again for you all. We thought that it was important, given the nature of this panel, for us to lead with the art. This idea of kind of arresting folks, right? And this idea of kind of agency and story. And there's so many different themes that I'm anxious to explore more as we continue this conversation around this idea. And I think you shared this at dinner. This idea of, so what if you were given 4 days and told to pack 2 suitcases because of your ancestry? What would you do? How would you think about that? And that this isn't something that just happened to happen in 1941. There's a history of that in this country, right, with the Native Americans and even yet today. And how do we think about this art as a way of telling story and arresting people, but also telling the story? And what impact do these experiences have on us? I think, and that's really where I think we want for Charles to talk a little bit more about your background, Charles, but also kind of this sense of identity and of beauty and what comes of this art. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. There in Japan, there's this saying. It goes, "Junin toido," and it means 10 people, 10 colors. And in English, I guess we would say, to each his own. Everyone has different taste. That's probably something that is true about beauty, but the beauty I want to talk about tonight is the kind of beauty that we want to agree about. So 10 people, 1 color sort of beauty. what we consider beautiful depends greatly on social agreement, which is to say that there's something in us that wants to agree about what is beautiful. The formulation of such a beauty, such a consensus about beauty, especially in highly diverse societies like ours, comes by way of adjustments that are often traumatic. Aligning beauty in a particularly assertive and sometimes alienating way. So what I want to do for the next 15 minutes is to think about a kind of beauty that is alienating. I was born in a little town called Richfield, Utah, in south central Utah. And my family ended up there because of the war, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Not to Fresno, but to Santa Anita racetrack, my family was sent, at least on my father's side. My mother was living in Washington State, and it just so happened that they both got sent to the same camp in near Cody, Wyoming, and that's where my mother and my father met and fell in love and got married and had their first child. Miles, seeing that was very almost overwhelming for me, because I've been to Heart Mountain. I'm going to go back there again in August for a family reunion. There aren't many barracks left in that camp, but I've often thought about my parents. My mother told me that the only date they could have was walking up and down the rows between the barracks. But when you think about it, it must have been dating paradise. Think about it. All those young people, nowhere to go, nothing else to do. Maybe we should have something like that. You know? So my father leaves the camp. He goes down to Utah to work as a farm laborer. He has his family join him on this small farm in the middle of nowhere. I grew up at least 2 miles from my nearest neighbor and another few miles from a town of 200 people. And it was extremely isolated. I realized fairly late in life that I didn't even have playmates until I went off to kindergarten when I was 5. So the people that we grew up with were mostly Scandinavian, Jensen, Christensen, they were mostly from either Denmark or Sweden. And they had come to that part of the world because they had fled from the East Coast and from the Midwest to live in Utah, where they could practice their religion in peace. And maybe it was their experience with persecution that made them welcome my family. My family were members of the Pure Land sect of Mahayana Buddhism. And they practiced Buddhism. My grandfather, who was my babysitter, one of the very first things he did was to pull a chair over in front of the dresser in his bedroom, make me stand there, put my hands together like this. He would put a rosary on my hands. He would light incense and a candle and hit a little bell twice. Ding, ding. And so I grew up praying to my family altar, but I also got sent every Sunday to the Mormon Sunday school. And my parents did that, faithfully every Sunday, never thinking that we would actually take to it, but in fact we did. And I still, consider myself to be a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But the point I want to make is that that environment was very different from my home environment, as you can imagine. And because of my affiliation with the church, I got sent to Japan at the age of 19 to be a missionary. And I had a life-changing moment there, which I'd like to share with you, if you don't mind. It's kind of a personal thing. So here I am. I'm at the Haneda Airport. There was no such thing as the Narita Airport yet. I'm standing kind of like this on the second floor, looking down into an atrium. I remember that the floor was white. It was marble. And the walls were also marble. And as I was waiting for my connecting flight to Sapporo, I look down and I see a row of young Japanese women pulling their luggage, their suitcases, across this marble floor, one after another. This was shortly after some brilliant person, I don't know who it was, got the idea that if you put wheels on your suitcase, they would be easier to move. But they didn't have those handles, that you pull up like this. All they had back then was kind of like a dog leash that you clicked onto your suitcase and pulled it. So you can imagine these beautiful women moving across the floor like this, and I saw them and I said to myself, wow, Japanese women are really beautiful. It just stunned me. Not because they were beautiful so much as because I had never thought that way before. The thought had never occurred to me that people who look like me could be beautiful. So on my way to Sapporo, I'm sitting there in my chair, and I'm thinking, why would I not think that? And eventually I came up with two reasons. Reason number one, all the Japanese women I knew were related to me. They were my grandmother, my mother, my sister, my cousins. So maybe I don't think they're pretty because that would be a little bit weird, right? Second reason, more serious reason, maybe I don't think Japanese people are beautiful because somehow I have been convinced that they're not. So then the question is, how would I come to think that? And the answer, simply put, is that, and maybe, I don't know if you can appreciate this or not, but I grew up in an environment, I think they call it America, where there are certain standards, certain forms of beauty that are put out there. And none of them included anyone that looked like me, right? So naturally, I just internalized this sense of beauty. And this sense of beauty, because it excluded me, I think it did me wrong. I think it messed me up. And the thing about it, though, is that I didn't realize I was so messed up, and I probably never would have discovered that had I not gone to Japan. The only reason I can be an American and be comfortable about being an American is because I went to Japan, right? I spent, since then, a lot of energy learning Japanese and learning Japanese culture. And I think that maybe one of the reasons I'm so motivated is because deep down inside, I know that I need to know that. And if I don't know that, it makes me very, very nervous to be an American. Do you understand what I'm saying? When the standards of beauty that get put out there with the assumption that they are shared standards of beauty, when those don't include you, when those don't include your life, they're very traumatic. They're so profoundly traumatic that they're almost hard to understand. I don't think there are people out there who stay up at night thinking, how can I make Charles feel uncomfortable about himself? I don't think it happens that way, you know. I think that in some ways it's very innocent, and for that reason, the innocence is kind of insidious. So beauty is kind of a complicated thing, and whether we see ourselves in it or not is a huge question. That's basically all I want to say. I want to say again that my encounter in Japan changed my life because I happen to be lucky, I think. I wonder about people who, in my situation, don't go to Japan. I hope they're not living desperate lives thinking that they're trying to be something. They have to be something other than who they are to be understood, to be loved, to be beautiful. So that's my point.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. Some of the things that you talked about, this notion of kind of living this dual reality of having one thing taught at home and having one thing in the external environment, and how we reconcile those things is, I think, something really important. And one of the things that you were talking about too is this idea of these standards of beauty that don't include you, and that you're kind of convinced of this. It's interesting to me, kind of in watching Miles and watching your piece, and this notion of being told that you're the enemy. Mm-hmm. Right, the Japanese Americans were the enemy, and so it's hard then not to start to internalize some of that kind of hatred, and how then do we kind of move forward, because it is kind of so innocent and insidious and kind of pervasive, and it pervades one's own consciousness, right? It pervades one's own kind of narrative of self, and going back to this question of agency, right? And how do you start to reclaim this idea of agency in terms of being able to claim your own story and who you are, and what parts do you want you need to know, right. And then to be able to move forward. I want to kind of turn things over to Ka to talk a little bit about your experience as a Hmong American woman growing up here in Wausau, and kind of how it relates to some of the things that Miles and Charles have just touched on.
Yeah, definitely. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm really grateful to be a part of this stage with these very distinguished speakers. I don't have any credentials as Milo, Charles, and Eric has, but I can offer you my views as a Hmong American and as a student. When Jean asked me if I wanted to be a part of this panel, I was pretty confused because the Japanese and Hmong, we really don't have very close ties to each other. When I met with Jean, I started off by telling her about an experience I had at Walmart. Long story short, it was about a year and a half ago, and I was walking around Walmart, and in my head, I was identifying the people I saw by what I saw physically. For example, I saw a white man. Oh, he's white. I saw an Asian woman. Oh, she's Asian. I saw 2 white women with a black baby. 2 women with a black baby. That can't be right. It was right at that moment, when I had identified that a black baby with 2 white women was odd, I realized, oh my God, I'm Asian. Surprisingly, I had never thought of myself as Asian. I always identified myself as an American, first and foremost, and a woman. But I had never identified myself as into the context of Asian. I had never stereotyped myself as having upturned eyes, black hair, brown eyes, and short, or in other words, Asian. Because that's what I did to the black baby and the 2 white women. I had stereotyped the baby and the 2 white women that somehow it was odd that one of the women, maybe its mother and the father was black, or one of the women's daughter was married or in a relationship with a black man, and they were just taking their grandbaby on a shopping trip. Any combination that you can think of why 2 women, maybe with a black baby, is that moment, I thought it was odd. I may be a bit paranoid now whenever I'm in a restaurant, at the mall, here at UWMC, wherever there are a lot of people, because now I wonder if others see me as a foreigner. Since my Walmart experience, I've done some soul searching into who I am, who other people are, why I do the things I do, and why others do the things they do, and getting to know my parents a lot more. After I left Jean's office, I was still a bit confused as to how Jean had connected me to Miles, Charles, and Eric, and the Japanese that were interned during World War II. And I needed to know. I needed to know what Jean saw. I had to make a connection. So I did the only thing that was at my disposal. I went to Google. I Googled Japanese internment World War II. So like any college student, I went straight to images for Japanese internment World War II, and I started to look at the pictures. The first pictures that I saw were lines and lines of Japanese men, women, and children behind a barbed wire fence, carrying the few possessions that they were able to carry with them into the internment camps. Those pictures touched a chord with me, because I related those pictures to the pictures of Hmong refugees that were in Thailand that had been repatriated back to Laos. I went to website after website and read about the psychological damage that internees occurred, about the violation of American rights and liberties, but I was still an outsider looking in from behind the glass window. I had realized that I read too much information, seen too many pictures, and all it meant to me was, it's just history, so what? What does it mean to me? So I sat back and decided to put myself in their shoes. What would they feel? What did they think? And in my mind, I thought about my American beliefs. I thought about Pearl Harbor. I thought about the pictures that I had seen. I thought about the repatriated Hmong refugees. I thought about World War II. I thought about the concentration camps in Germany. I thought about the end of the war. The end of the war. And right then, it hit me like a ton of bricks. World War II ended because of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's when it became personal. I thought that if I was in a camp and at the end of the war, they dropped atomic bombs on the country I was born in, or the country that my parents were from, what were they going to do to me? They had taken away my home, my freedom, and now they bombed the country that defines who I am ethnically and racially. As you can see, I'm getting a bit dramatic, and it scares the living crap out of me. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, President George W. Bush signed into law the Patriot Act. According to the Patriot Act, a terrorist or terrorist organization includes any 2 or more individuals, organized or not, that uses a dangerous device with intent to endanger someone's safety or damage property, which includes resistance movements. Any resistance group that is engaged in armed conflict with its government could be considered a terrorist organization, even if it is pro-democracy. Can you guess which ethnic group here in Wausau fits the Patriot Act's definition of a resistance group terrorist? For those of you who don't know, the Hmong were allies to the United States during the Vietnam War. Hmong troops intercepted supplies and weapons to the Pathet Lao and Viet Cong on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in northern Laos. American pilots were taught to recognize the traditional dress of the Hmong. In case he was shot down, he would be able to recognize an ally, and guided the US Army through the thick jungles. Because the victors in Vietnam War are presently the government of Laos, and the Hmong fought against them during the Vietnam War, we were classified as terrorists. In 2005, Homeland Security's attorneys applied the definition of a terrorist to Hmong people. I remember the first time I heard that the government had classified us as terrorists. It was 2007. I was on Facebook, and one of my friends had put that into his status. I questioned the statement because I knew that in the Vietnam War, we were allies to the US cause. So I went to Google and started to do some research. Sadly, it was true. There's an article in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel in which Senator Russ Feingold stated, "The Hmong has effectively been labeled terrorists as the result of the support they gave the US during the Vietnam War. This is both unconscionable and the saddest of ironies." As a sponsor to the amendment of the Patriot Act on classifying the Hmong as terrorists, he also stated, "Rest assured, I will continue to work with my Senate colleagues until this problem is finally fixed." On December 26, 2007, President George W. Bush signed Bill H.R. 2764. This bill contained specific language that the Hmong are not considered a terrorist organization and that automatic relief would be instated. For 7 years, I was considered a terrorist. My family were terrorists. My friends were terrorists. When my research was over, I realized that for 3 or 4 years between 2001 and 2007, I was living in Milwaukee on my own, and I thought, what if the government had decided to put me into a camp? I would have been separated from my family. In 2005, I'd gone on a school trip to Europe. The what-ifs that entered my mind scared me more than anything I could imagine. In a sense, Japanese Americans were considered terrorists during World War II. And unfortunately, their fears came true. We were considered terrorists, and our fears could have come true. The American person has always valued individuality. Americans as a whole has always valued individuality. Individuality is hardwired into the American mind. Individuality is what's so beautiful and attractive about the American culture. And as Americans, we defend and uphold these rights. But I want to pose a question. When you think of an American, do you think of someone who looks like me? Do you see color in the American face, or don't you see color at all? I want to end by telling you about another Walmart experience I had. This time, my sisters were with me, and we were in the parking lot, and I was looking for a parking space, and I spotted one right by the door. And I went into the parking space, but I wasn't perpendicular to the other car next to me, so I reversed my car in hopes of lining myself up again. While I was backing up, this car behind me seemed to not see me, and I was backing out, so to avoid a car accident, I honked my horn. The driver stopped, and I was able to line myself up perpendicular. The driver of the car parked not too far from me, and while we were walking into Walmart, he was giving me the evil eye. And I turned around and smiled and said to him, "I'm sorry. I thought you were going to hit me, so that's why I honked my horn." By this time, we had entered Walmart, and he says, "Why don't you go get your green card and learn how to drive?" I whipped around angrily and said at the top of my voice, "I'm an American, you bleep bleep." The color drained out of his face, and he didn't know what to say. I walked away, and my sisters couldn't believe what I had said. So I just wanted to leave you guys with this thought that, America really is the melting pot of the world. And so when you see someone who is not white and has a little color to their face, don't assume that they are a foreigner or if they're not American, because most likely they are.
Thank you. It's interesting when you were sharing that last story. As I mentioned in my introduction, my family's been in this country since 1886, 87, 88, and yet I'm often asked, people comment, your English is so good. Where did you learn how to speak English so good? It's like, well, the St. Paul Public Schools, thank you very much. Or how long have you been in this country, right? I mean, what we make these assumptions based on how people look, right? And we're very willing, while we are very, as a country, we want to believe in this rugged individualism kind of narrative that we have as a country, we're also very quick to start to group people together, right, when it's convenient, right, whether it be by race or by ethnicity. And what's particularly frightening is when we start to do this as a government, right? I mean, kind of to your point, that when as this country that's kind of ruled for the people, by the people, of the people, when we as a country allow for our legislators and for public policy to start to actually exclude people from that kind of melting pot narrative that you just so adequately spoke about. Yeah, I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I want to kind of wrap things up, but I do want to I want to start, I guess, just by thanking our panelists for sharing their stories, so thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's again, just for me, it's just been such a great honor to be here, and just to say, just in closing, that this isn't this while we open with the art and we open with the story of the Japanese internment, this isn't really a story about history. This is about saying, how do we learn from history, and how do we not let things like the internment happen again? How is it that we can be activated as individuals and as a society? So when terrible things happen, whether it's the 9/11 or what, I remember also when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, and in the Twin Cities they started rounding up all the Muslims, right? It was 2 white guys, right? So like, how do we not fall into this trap? How do we not allow hysteria when there's a tragic incident like the Chai Vang and the hunting incident, right? Where we start to really demonize an entire group of people because of the actions of one individual or one situation, right? So this isn't a story about history as much as a story about today and a story about Wausau. And how do we all kind of take responsibility for moving forward? So one is, while we start there, it's not a story about history. The other one that I want to go back to is this notion of as we open up for Q&A, I want to go back to Miles's point about the Trojan horse, right? And this idea of the power of the arts. The power of the arts to give agency, the power of the arts to give a sense of identity, the power of the arts to stand up to some of these injustices and speak to them in our country, right? And how powerful that is. And then finally, just to close on this last piece, which is really, like Khan spoke to, that to me, as an American, as a fourth-generation American, this piece around the diversity of our country is our strongest asset. Right? As we move forward in the 21st century, if you look at kind of our competitive advantage as a country, I'm going to suggest to you all that is our greatest advantage, is that we have so many people with so many different backgrounds and so many different histories and so many different narratives. So how do we create a tent that's large enough so that we can include all those narratives, and so we can find a way actually to be stronger as a whole rather than as individuals? So with that, I just want to open it up to questions. I think we have some mics. Is that true? So if you want to just raise your hand if you have any questions of the panel or comments that you'd like to share with the group, please, yeah.
Well, I would just like to suggest that the way you can do something to promote your point of view is to keep doing exactly what you're doing. As annoying as it may be to your schedule, it's really important, because we need people who are sensitive to this whole issue. Some of us old white guys have been raised abroad, or maybe we spoke a different language before we spoke English. We have a little understanding of some of the outsider situation that you refer to, but it's pretty apparent by what's going on in the country now, politically, that every generation has to relearn this, and it really helps to have people like you who get up and make the remembrance to stand up for it and say something in public about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I guess I just want to, again, extend my thanks to the Lecture in Fine Arts series and also to the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, because it was really them that brought it together. And I really commend UWMC for kind of convening this group and for engaging this topic, because again, while it is about art and it is about history and it is about public policy, it's also about Wausau, it's about today, and it's about the future. So I really commend you all and for you all for coming tonight, for being here. So I would say thank you. I actually can't see the house light, so I'm relying on you all to kind of raise your hand. Come on, there must be somebody has some reaction, thought, comment, something, please. No, otherwise we'll just go on. There's also coming up here.
Great question.
Do you want to take it?
Sure. I mean, just, you know, I think about it in terms of the way I learned about it as a kid, you know, in the 70s growing up. And, you know, I remember my dad took us out to Tule Lake, you know, the internment camp, and we walked around out there, you know, and he had talked about it, but there was something about that kind of physical act of seeing it, you know, and kind of, and there was an exhibit up in Portland at the Portland Historical Museum about the Japanese-American experience there, and it talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, and there's something about it's one of the powers of institutions, and I remember talking to one of your famous professors here, Doug Hostler, you know, I think I'm pronouncing it right, but he's talking about that, about the idea of like, you know, yeah, racism, you know, I'm not a big racist, right, you know, like, good for me, he was very funny about it, he was great. And he said, but you know, that's where I started to think about, well, what are the institutions of racism? What are the mechanisms by which racism perpetuates itself? And I think that idea, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's really powerful. And I think we kind of need that visceral sense of this happened. I mean, this happened. This is what it looked like. And I remember, you know, in Ashland, where I'm from, you know, I was the only Japanese-American guy around, that's for sure, you know, as far as student my age. And there was one other Chinese-American guy, and his family owned the Chinese restaurant downtown. And, you know, a couple of years ago, there was a big exhibit at our art museum about the history of Chinese in Ashland, you know, lefty, liberal Ashland. And, you know, it was that 19th century, you know, turn of the century, laying the railroad, and sure enough, there were a bunch of Chinese living in Ashland at the time, and they were then summarily rounded up and, you know, kicked out, you know, and the laws, when you read the language, it's chilling, you know, because it's very blunt, it's very ugly. You know, if you read a Jim Crow law, or to read, you know, that's why we started our animation with the actual, I mean, it really, what did you say? Like, you know, scares the crap out of me. Yeah. You know, when I think about seeing that posted up on a telephone pole, you know, so I think there's something with kids. You don't really have to tell them much, in a sense. You just have to tell them that this happened, that this is here, this is just a fact, you know, and then you don't want to be ashamed of it, but you want to think about it, you know, so think about that. And a lot of it does come from learning how to question, too. I mean, that you should ask questions. You know, I'm as big of a Ben Franklin fan as the next guy, you know, but it was interesting. You see some of the things that some of these people said about, you know, race and things like that. It's not very pretty, you know. It's chilling kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, just asking those questions. I think that's what I think about when I think about my kid, you know, and I said, well, I want to tell you about this stuff. I want you to be thinking about these things. You know, it's kind of like getting some street smarts or something about the way the world works. But
and I guess I would just add to that two pieces. One is I appreciate, Miles, your inclusion of historical documents and kind of to be able to see very vividly the language that was used and the images that were portrayed in the mass media and through government documents and propaganda. I think the other point that's important, for me at least, is that we're doing the same thing today, right? If we look at what's happening in the debate around immigration and Latinos, if we look at some of the Senate bill in Arizona, we look at some of the things that we're doing right now, there's some haunting parallels to it. And I think it's really important that as a society we be mindful of that. And again, remember our history and remember that we can't, if we fail to remember history, we're doomed to repeat it. Right? And so I think that it's important for us to keep that in mind as we think about, this isn't something that happened in 1941, it's something that's happening in 2010. So that's one piece. The second piece on the Exclusion Act specifically and on children, I think, again, it's about let's not forget these things. Let's remind people about what has happened in our history. And so for me and with my children, I have two daughters that are 9 and 11, it's about sharing the stories. It's about telling them that their great-grandmother, who's now 101 years old, who was born in the United States, lost her citizenship when she married my grandfather, who was a Japanese national, because of the Alien Exclusion Act, right? So she was without citizenship. Even though she was born a U.S. citizen, she lost her citizenship and had to retake the citizenship test so she could actually be documented, right? So my grandmother was an illegal alien, in effect. Well, I guess a legal alien, but she was an alien in the country that she was born in, right? Well, how do we prevent that from happening again? And I think it's about not necessarily trying to beat people over the head with it, but just say, hey, this happened, and let's not let it happen again. So, other questions or comments? Is there one up front here? Oh.
Well, I just had a comment. I think it was you, Eric, who talked about Hawaii, how they couldn't put the whole population in an internment camp. And that just made me think about, Japan was an enemy of the U.S. during World War II, but then so was Germany. And why didn't they put Germans in an internment camp? And I think because they couldn't. There were just too many of them. So it makes me think, why did they single out this one group? Was it just because their numbers are small, or do they have some other reason behind it? Because you think about a lot of the enemies of the United States, they're people who are different religions and different parts of the world, so many times in Asia and now in the Middle East. And so what is it about certain parts of the world and certain peoples that the American government just sees as so threatening? And so it's something that's really sort of burning in my mind right now.
Oh, well, it's just some points of information. They actually, they meaning the government, the United States government, actually considered putting Italian Americans behind barbed wire. But again, it was logistically difficult, and I think also as a matter of context, California, you should know, had a long history of prejudice, governmental prejudice against Chinese and Japanese people, exclusion laws and so forth. And I think that was probably one of the reasons it happened there. You should also know that it's not very American to say, I don't like these people, so let's throw them in jail. So when they decided to incarcerate all these people, over 100,000 of them, they made it look democratic. They held the so-called Tolan hearings. I don't know if you know about this. These were public hearings that were held up and down the West Coast. And their purpose was to have a discussion, right? We just don't want to, we want to throw these people in prison, but maybe you don't think it's such a great idea. But if you read the transcript of these meetings, it's pretty hard to take, because the only people that were actually allowed to say anything were those who were in favor of internment, including, members of the Japanese American Citizens League, which decided, along the way that they would contribute to the solution rather than to the problem. So again, that's a part of our history. One other thing is that You know, we just had a census, and everybody who was involved with the census said, you know, if you're a real American, you should do this because, you know, it's important that we have this information, and don't think that we'll ever abuse this information. Well, guess what? The day after Pearl Harbor, these people who, you know, they become what we now call the FBI, show up at my grandfather's house, and they're going to take him away. This is the day after. And my father, you know, he knew that he had some rights, and so he defended his father and said, no, you're not going to take my father. You know, he doesn't have to go with you. And so they went away, and they didn't come back. But the point I would make is that, you know, you don't get that information overnight. That information came from the census. So I hate to say it, but.
Gee, thanks, Charles. Appreciate that wonderful thought.
Take mine back.
Where's my census form? Anyway, I also just want to add, I think that it's also easy, you know, and it goes to, I think, back to this question of art and how we understand the world and how we see the world. And oftentimes it's easy to see difference, and it's sometimes harder to see the similarities. And so whether it be a religious difference or ethnic difference or racial difference, whatever you want to call it, it's easy for us to sometimes segregate people in populations. And we do it all the time, right? I mean, stereotyping is how we understand the world, but I think it's a question of how do we understand our motives behind that? And how do we actually take the time to analyze and take the time to be reflective and take the time to be thoughtful about the assumptions that we make about the other? And again, how is it in this country, at least, do we create a narrative that is kind of broad enough and wide enough to allow for all people to be seen and a part of that? So,
Can I say one thing to the question before this question about how do you teach your children to be not racist? I've been sitting here thinking, have I ever taught I have 3 children, have I ever taught my children not to be racist? And I can't think of an example of when I taught them not to be racist. And so in my thinking about why not, I guess I would have to say this about this problem, that I teach my children how to be compassionate all the time and good people, but I don't necessarily teach them to, you know, love A types, B types, C types, because I think that the solution, at least for my children, is to be the kind of people that, you know, kind of love everybody. Just, you know, whatever. I mean, because, you know, race, we're talking about race today, but we could talk about lots of other things if we wanted to. And you know, everybody belongs to some, you know, weird category. So I think I would say that at least from my point of view, it's important to have these pointed kind of discussions, but the more general maybe the discussion, the better.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah, I think the mic is coming from the back. And there's another.
I just kind of a question and observation just between, particularly, I guess, among the 3 stories and the art that we got to see tonight. I was just thinking how the discussion was about identity and American beauty, and I just felt that hearing your stories and watching the film, I was thinking that, I guess I don't know how to say it really well, but I mean, to me, parts of both of Charles and Ka's story and the film itself, they all had the sense of the grotesque or like a revolting moment. And I sort of wanted to know how you guys see that as being connected to identity or forming identity or art, because I mean, the film's terrifying. It really taps in, I mean, in a powerful way. I mean, the Trojan horse, you know, is terrifying when it opens up. And even Ka's story, you know, you're sort of that moment of recognition of something terrible, or, you know, at that moment feeling something terrible inside, or Charles talking about, you know, recognizing this, I don't know, like self-loathing or almost, or something, you know. So all those things to me sort of had, the theme was more like this grotesque thing that happens that turns into something positive. actually, from your stories. But I don't know, how do you see that connecting to identity or art, I guess, if that's a question?
That's great. I think that's a really great observation. Actually, thank you for that. I've just been noticing as I've been out here, I'm like, when I go and talk to fifth graders or college kids or, being here, I'm thinking, I'm kind of taking notes about things to use, in my teaching and thinking and artwork. I mean, that's a great observation. That was really nice. So thank you for that. I think just speaking for the film, I mean, just the idea of dehumanization through imagery, which sounds so, it sounds so simple, the idea that, well, the Japanese were depicted as inhuman with big teeth and glasses and squid, but it's a really powerful thing, to depict people like that, you think it's, and we do, it's like, that's kind of funny, but it's weird because it puts a barrier between you and the actual human experience of these other people, it's like, and I think it has to do, at least indirectly, probably with Charles's experience, and like, Kyle was saying, this sense of, oh, wow, I do this, but I don't know, what did you guys think about it?
Well, I think that in regards to identity, personally, me myself, and most of my Asian friends, Hmong friends, we were the ones that we were born and or raised here in Wausau. The Wausau School District, the community, does a great job of assimilating us into American culture. And I think that as young adults, we struggle with what's beautiful and what's not. And at home, we're taught that, wearing these intricate, very heavy, traditional clothing are beautiful. And we know that it's beautiful. And then when we wear these clothing out and everyone sees them, they'd say that it's beautiful too. But then it contradicts when we watch TV and there's this blonde, blue-eyed model, and that's beautiful. And we see, blue eyes and blonde hair and 6'1", that's beautiful, And here we are, dark hair, brown eyes, 5'2", and so then it confuses us, like what's beautiful and what's not. And then when we go to school, the majority of our peers are white. And, and when we look up to them too, and we see that they're beautiful, but when we look at ourselves, the minority, we just kind of see, short, dark hair, brown eyes. And so then when we grow up, we relate beauty to, the white image. And so I think that as an individual, we need to come back to our roots and find out what is beautiful about us, because we already have seen, we've already seen what's beautiful in another culture that we're a part of also. And so I think it's very important that as we grow up, in regards to our children and our families, we need to teach ourselves that we are as beautiful and as valuable as the majority too, and to teach that and instill that within our community.
I was quite taken by Miles's animated movie because it did focus so intently on this notion of monstrosity. The word that the guy is saying, bakeru means to change, and bakemono means things that change, and that's the term we use for monsters. There's an interesting thesis by a guy named Komatsu Hirokazu, who is the expert on monsters in Japan, and his thesis is that there are things that are yokai or obake, and then there are things that are kami or God. And his opinion is that they're the same thing, and that the only difference between something that is a god to you or a monster to you is how you propitiated it. So if you treat it in the right way, you remember it, you respect it, then it works to your favor. But if you ignore it or you mistreat it, then it becomes something that haunts you. With regard to the question of the grotesque, you know, if you ask me point blank, is Miles's film beautiful? I don't know how I would answer that question.
It's okay.
On some level, of course, yes. But on another level, maybe not so obviously beautiful, but true. Definitely. And I appreciate that question. I appreciate, and I appreciate it.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I also just want to thank you for the question. And I would add that I'm struck by this, Kyle, what you said about how the schools and the society has done a great job of assimilating people of color. But that then leads to this kind of dual reality that, Charles, you spoke of. And I think it's when, and you also talked about how then these adjustments are dramatic, right? When I need to reconcile kind of this dual reality of what I learn at home or what I learn in my traditions or what I learn in of my own kind of narrative, my own history, with what I'm told by society and this culture that I'm told to assimilate into. And when those things aren't, when those things are separate, right? When they're not actually, when I'm not seen in that broader narrative, I think that's when you get that kind of, that dramatic adjustment, which then leads to that kind of, that trauma or that experience that can manifest itself in really different ways. So that would be my response to it, is that because you live in this dual reality, when those worlds collide, it can be very traumatic. And how one then manages it, I think is you can find power in that, or it can be kind of the ghost that haunts you. And it's how we do, how individuals are able to navigate that kind of moment in time. So. Is there another question in front here?
What was grotesque was not. What was grotesque in the movie had nothing to do with people of color. What was grotesque had to do with the racist mentality of the mainstream culture and its hard-heartedness and its cruelty in rounding up people and putting them aside and separating them from the mainstream and dehumanizing them. What was grotesque was the figure of the monster in the camp. That was not a Japanese American. And I think we would all do well to think about the roots of racism in the United States and be aware that it goes back to Columbus, and that the early history of the United States is a history of a country that was based in racism and genocide, and that the history that we are often taught in school is a very nice democracy myth, but in fact, even when the United States first began to codify its laws and rules, humanity was only granted to white males, and that everyone else has had to fight for acceptance in one way or another, including the women from that culture. American Indian people did not become citizens until 1924, and yet this land was wrenched from them through a horrid acts of genocide. So I think that racism, if it is going to change, is really an issue for European American people to grasp and look at and understand and decide if we're going to, if in fact the institutions are going to change in such a way as they add up to what the United States of America says it's all about. that equality and justice for all and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a lot of changes that need to take place. And it's going to take the effort of the mainstream culture, as well as, I mean, really, you people are being extremely gracious. Extremely gracious. Because racism never was something, that was not your issue, your problem. Racism is an issue for white European Americans.
Well, I think it's pretty universal, though. I mean, I think, I appreciate that, and I think that's really true. And I think exactly what you're saying about the history, like, that is the history. You know, you're right, and that's absolutely true, and that's definitely worth learning and considering and teaching. And I think, too, but I'd like to say, it's a white European problem, but, it's everywhere, certainly in Japan. I mean, and it's funny, too, it's funny how nasty it gets among people that, in the United States, since we have such a diverse society, we're kind of more used to discriminating based on things like skin color and things like that. Other places, you go to England or something, or, Great Britain, it's like, oh man, you're Scottish, you're Irish, you're Northerner, oh, you're, and they're all white, and they're perfectly willing to stab each other in the face and kill, blow up buildings and do terrorism, so it's not so much a skin thing, or Protestants versus Catholics, they figured out some pretty good ways to go at it, and so it's this, it really is, it's kind of, we talked about this a little bit before we got together. The idea of race itself is it's an incredibly flimsy construct, So, my son, he's like, I guess he'd be a quarter Japanese. He's probably more than a quarter Irish. Got some Eastern European, kind of tall, blonde hair, green eyes, kind of a kid, but what's he going to check on the census? What are we even asking that question for, in one way? Well, there's a good reason why we're asking that question. It has to do with kind of, again, some of the structures of, well, here are some things we can do to work with the mechanism of racism and just institute some rather, important, crude, but hey, it works, and things of minority hiring, or to understand how, oh, gee, guess what? There, this percentage of, these positions are filled by 99% white males, So it does give you some information, but on the other hand, it's a double-edged sword, The idea of race, I don't know, I was thinking about Ryan Giggs, I don't know if anyone here is a soccer fan, but, he's he was the big superstar of English football kind of before David Beckham, and it turns out, there was a surprise that he's, hey, I'm black, which was funny because he doesn't look, it's like if Larry Bird said, hey, I'm black, or something, kind of this funny thing, and so people, what, and so the race, it's like, well, what does that mean, in a way, and so it's a good thing to think about that, what is that? It's like that. Like I think like Charles and people were saying, it's like kind of a humanity thing. It's like, Anyway.
I just want to add, I very much appreciate the comments, and I do think that's, if there is a takeaway, I think it is to say that we all need to own this, right? This isn't about, Charles or Miles or Kyle or Eric needing to own this. This is about all of us as a society needing to own this and own our part in it and own what we can do to change it and moving forward so that we can create the future that we want to see. I would also say that it extends race. I would agree that race is a really flimsy social construct, but that this kind of idea of mainstream and margin and kind of overness it happens all the time, right? Whether it's able-bodiedness or religion or eye color, hair color, height, driving, not driving, age, whatever. We do this all the time about discriminating against other people, and so I think it's about a self-awareness of when we do that. And how we can prevent that from happening as we move forward. I want to respect the time that we have. I think it's time to wrap up. I do want to invite folks. There will be a reception with coffees and cookies outside next door, and I think the panelists will all be there to answer more questions if people have questions or would like to engage in further conversation on a one-on-one basis. But otherwise, I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good job. Good job.